Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and today we're going back to basics with some important information, reminders, and strategies around nutrition, lifestyle, and our kids' development and behavior. You know that I talk about nutrition and lifestyle a lot on the show, but I really thought it would be helpful to remind us all of the reasons why the food decisions we make for our kids and families are so important, especially with coming out of the pandemic. I think it's a good time to take an honest look at perhaps the current food landscape in our homes and identify some steps that might be helpful to improve physical and mental health for all of us in the family. So to help us think about this, I've invited Dr. Natasha Beck on the show today. Let me tell you a bit about her. She's a parenting expert and founder of Dr. Organic Mommy, an online resource focused on pregnancy, parenting, and non-toxic living. She holds a doctorate in clinical psychology, specializing in pediatric neuropsychology, and a master's in public health, specializing in child and family health. She's also certified in leadership education in neurodevelopmental disabilities from Children's Hospital Los Angeles. From how to handle tantrums to mealtime difficulties to helping families live healthier lives, Dr. Organic Mommy aims to help every family make healthy decisions, drawing on her experience as a mom and a parenting expert. Her parenting expertise combines the use of Waldorf, Montessori, and RIE philosophies, all of which we've covered at various times on the show, tied into cognitive behavioral and play therapy. When she's not working on Dr. Organic Mommy, Natasha's busy raising her 3 children, and she's got a 4th on the way, and her 2 fur babies with her husband, and serves on the boards of various organizations. Welcome to the show, Natasha. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd love to start with just a little bit of your background in combining of these areas, because I don't meet too many other clinical psychologists like myself who really are passionate about and have done advanced training in things like health and lifestyle and public health and family wellness. So I just love to hear a little bit of the story of how those pieces came together for you.
Sure. I was diagnosed myself with ADHD and dyslexia, now known as reading disorder, when I was a child. And I noticed the impacts of my environment on me. And when I was older and decided to go to graduate school and was working in a hospital setting over at USC County Hospital, I noticed the impact of diet, especially on kids, when I was working under a developmental pediatrician. When they would come in, children with McDonald's breakfast, and we'd have to test them, and it was just impossible to get them to even stay seated. So that was kind of the start of which I noticed the impacts of diet. And so I ended up applying that to my own education and wanting to further that with a master's in public health, and ended up researching more and more, even when I had children, and then looking into the environmental toxins and everything else that our children are exposed to, and even when you're pregnant as well.
Absolutely. And, it's so, I think for so many of us, the way that we sort of came to understanding this was through personal experience, either, issues for ourselves or for our children. And it's so interesting to me how this is still sort of an outlier in the fields of medicine and mental health when it comes to just the basics of child learning, attention, behavior. Like I can think back to, just like you, like doing my pre and postdoctoral work in a children's hospital setting, and like being called in to do evaluations or do consults, in clinics where I'm like looking at it, I'm like, okay, fundamentally, if your kid's like eating candy bars and ice cream all day long to put on weight, because that's what you've been told to do for their physical health condition, like we're gonna have some, learning and attention problems, and just how that stuff wasn't talked about. It was like, well, they need an evaluation and, some kind of treatment. Nobody talked about the impact of what we were encouraging families to feed their kids, like on how their brains were functioning. So I think that some of that's changing now, but at least from my perspective, we have a long way to go for that message to make it into the mainstream.
Oh, I definitely agree. I mean, we definitely have a lot more options now, but I don't think it's as mainstream as it could be.
So I'm curious because, you have children of your own, you work with families, you certainly have a large community of parents that you connect with online. I'm interested in hearing, like, what are some of the biggest knowledge gaps or misunderstandings, that parents have about the role of food, nutrition more broadly, even lifestyle kinds of things as it relates to their kids' development, their kids' behavior? Like, where do you see parents either having misunderstandings or just a total knowledge gap with that?
I think the biggest thing is that parents think that, oh, if my child's going to reject a food that I offer them, then that means I have to give them something else, and they become a short order chef. Uh-huh. And so I always refer back to like Ellen Satter Institute, where she says, you as the parent decide what and when they eat, and you as the child decide if and how much. And you should always rely on that. The child, unless they have a medical condition, they know when they're hungry or not. And I think there's a lot of education that's warranted, especially for parents, to understand that you don't need to be a short order chef.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And, obviously, as you said, in cases with feeding disorders and those kinds of things, that's a bit different. But in general, I would agree. And, that idea that they rejected it, so I need to give them what they want so they'll eat, that really does set up some problematic dynamics then in terms of not only how we're feeding them, but also what we're feeding them. Of parents coming in and saying like, I want
they're only going to eat bread, and they're only going to eat the buttered pasta or off the kids menu or chicken fingers. And you get stuck in this habit and this cycle of eating only certain types of what I call like the brown foods. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have that variety of, colors in your diet. And then you end up lacking a lot of nutrients. Mm-hmm. And then that ends up having a lot of consequences. And you've got this domino effect that's happening with our children in a variety of different ways in their life.
Yeah. I want to focus in on two of what you and I think both agree are big offenders in terms of nutrition for kids, food for kids, and how it impacts their brain function. And that is sugar, particularly added sugars, and then the chemicals that are added to food, whether we're talking about food dyes or, preservatives or things, because I see those two areas as sort of, low-hanging fruit for parents to understand and make some changes. So let's start with added sugars first. Yeah. And just give us a good overview of why should we be aware of, concerned about the amount of sugar that our kids are consuming each day?
I mean, I think sugar is going to become the new hot topic, and it already kind of has been, because we're seeing the impacts now on sugar on our children. I mean, the obesity rates are climbing like exponentially. Type 2 diabetes is on the rise in children when it's actually known as an adult disease. And so we have a big problem on our hands. The problem is with sugar is that we don't realize that it impacts everything. It impacts our sleep. It impacts our behavior, our oral health, which impacts our gut health, our liver, our ability to focus in school, our ability to be able to sit for, a certain amount of time. So, and then we end up having parents who say, my kids, they've got attentional problems. We've got to put them and medicate them. And there's for sure definitely kids who have ADHD. I'm one of them. But, we've got almost 10 million kids diagnosed in the US with ADHD. And so we've got to think about, all right, is there something else that we can do to help offset some of those symptoms and decrease those symptoms? And sugar, artificial dyes, preservatives, those are things that we can kind of try to avoid or lessen. Mm-hmm.
And, one of the misunderstandings or misconceptions that I see out there is that a lot of people think that this is just opinion. I think people really in general, whether it's out of like preferring not to know the truth about how much research there is, right? Because we can sort of stay in denial then that it's important, or they just don't realize like there's an entire body of research literature now around the connections between added sugar, preservatives, chemicals, and kids' development and brain function.
Oh, 100%. You can easily go search for it right now just on Google Scholar and find tons of evidence-based studies that are showing the correlation between all of these different behaviors and, sugar and food dyes and preservatives.
Yeah. And I think that's just so important because I think sometimes, people sort of go, oh, that's just kind of woo-woo, or, oh, that's your opinion, or, oh, and it's like, no.
Or we grew up that way with sugar and we're fine.
Right.
We ended up fine.
Right. It's like, I didn't learn about any of this in my clinical psychology PhD program. It wasn't until I became a parent and started seeing all these connections in the clinic that I started delving into the research, and I felt kind of ripped off. Like, wait a second, there's this whole body of scientific literature around the connections between these things and mental health for kids. And yet I went through umpteen years of schooling and it was like not a thing that was focused on. I don't know if you had the same experience, but that's how I came to it, was like through doing the research myself and saying, oh, wait, there is a lot of research around this.
I mean, I definitely had it addressed in my public health program, but not in my psychology program, which I was disappointed at. Yeah. And I'm hoping that we're starting to introduce more of the diet, the environmental, toxins just around us, because those all play a role in what's going on. And when parents say to me, oh, well, I was fine, I've had those, great, not real evidence. But the thing is that how do you account for the huge increase in ADHD, the huge increase in autoimmune disorders, the huge increase in obesity, type 2 diabetes? And I could keep going, where is that coming from? Yeah. And so you've got to figure that there's something going on in our environment. Our genetics aren't changing that much.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, to an earlier point that you made about, look, kids and adults have brain-based differences, right? Like, we know that neurodivergent brains are real things. We're not suggesting that by reducing the amount of added sugar in your child's diet that, they're not going to be the person that they are. But what we are saying is sometimes these symptoms are caused by these kinds of things. And even in people with neurodivergent brains, addressing the good foundations of nutrition allow them to feel and function better, right? It's like a win-win for everybody.
100%. Yeah. 100%. And then you're actually getting the nutrients that you should be getting. You're not getting those huge insulin spikes from consuming all of this sugar.
Let's talk a bit about, because, you have a master's in public health, and, we talk about sort of on a global level, or at least on a US level, what we're seeing as far as these chronic health issues. And I think that people often with sugar, their brain goes to more of the physiological pieces of like, oh, I don't want my child to be obese, or, oh, I'm concerned about, type 2 diabetes, which, as you mentioned, didn't even exist in kids 25 years ago, and now is like rampant non-alcohol fatty liver disease, which we didn't see in kids, that now we do solely, as through the influence of added sugar. So break it down for us then of, okay, we need to be concerned about this sugar. Why is this such a bigger problem now? Because, you said we kind of grew up eating some of these things. But there's a difference now, isn't there, in terms of how much and the type? So speak to that, because I think that is a compelling thing for parents to understand.
So there used to be only two types of sugar. There was sugar cane and sugar that came from sugar beets. Now there's almost 200 different kinds of sugars out there, and under different guises of different types of sugar. And it's very hard to figure out what's in our products, and then there's refined sugar, where it's like a chemical breakdown, versus unrefined sugars. And back when I was a kid, at least in the 80s and 90s, there was the whole concept of low fat, non-fat.
Right.
What happened? Okay, well, if you get rid of the fat makes everything taste good. What do? Well, you add in a bunch of sugar. And so that was the start of this process of like adding in all this sugar. And now, luckily, there have been changes where we can actually see it on the nutrition labels, where it shows you the added sugar. And by 2020, they've had to address that. For smaller companies, it's by 2021 that they actually now need to show how much added sugar is in there. And the reason why you want to look at the added sugar is because even the American Academy of Pediatrics only recommends about 24 grams of sugar for kids ages 2 and up. And I would actually look at Dr. Michael Goran's research over at USC, who even breaks it down further, because 2 to 17 is a huge gap. The amount of calories, a 2-year-old is eating is very different from a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
So you've got to really be mindful of under 2, they don't want you having any sugar, added sugar. And after 2, it's somewhere between 0 and 24 grams of sugar. And that adds up real quick is the problem, and you don't realize that sugar is hidden in everything.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge problem. And, we had Michael Gran and Emily Ventura on the show back last year when their book Sugar Proof came out. Yeah. So if you missed that episode, go back and listen to that because it's really good. And it gets into like the history of this, like it's really such good information. But let's talk about that. So we want to keep kids under that amount of added sugar. And yet, as you said, it adds up so quickly. What are some of the practical ways you have found as a mom, as somebody working with kids and families? How can we do that? Because I know that some parents instantly feel over like, oh, I'm gonna have to give up everything my kid likes. It's going to be a huge stressor for me. It's going to be nothing but fights and issues, like an immediately sort of.
And I don't have the time either.
Yeah. And just shut down to it because of an assumption that it's just going to be too much to deal with. So talk to us about how to make that easier, how to make that feel more doable.
So I'm going to start with breakfast, because I think with breakfast, if you're setting your child up with having basically their daily amount of sugar in just one meal, it's really going to impact how they're learning in school. And trust me, you're going to hear it from your teachers. They're going to come back and say, hey, they're having trouble sitting still. They're really not listening. They're always acting silly. What's going on? What's going on at home? And if you take some of these steps that I will talk about, I really promise you that you will see some improvement. So when it comes to breakfast, I'm going to assume you've got your juice box, which basically has anywhere between, 15 to 25 grams of sugar, which there you go. There's your whole sugar for the day. A muffin, which, if it's a store-bought muffin, 20 grams of sugar also. And your typical cereal, like your Fruity Pebbles, your Lucky Charms, whatever. And maybe you're doing like a Honey Nut Cheerios, still has tons of sugar in it. Probably, I think it's like, don't quote me on this pregnancy brain, but like 10 grams of sugar in a bowl, So let's think about simple recipes that you can do in the morning. Granola. And if you can make some granola, even better, because you can control the amount of sugar and you can add unrefined sugar like honey in it as a sweetener, and give yourself some granola that you make with like some, rolled oats, throw in some flax seeds, chia seeds in there. And I've got a recipe on my page. I make this in bulk, like once a month, keep it in my freezer, and then put in some plant-based milk, whatever milk of choice. And that's at least a better option because it's more nutrient dense, because those grains they've got more, protein in them. They've got more, iron, it just fiber. Exactly. Yeah. The other thing I like to do is oatmeal. Now, I think parents are very weary about oatmeal because it just looks like mush. So what I like to do is I like to cook the oatmeal down with cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon. And you can do this the night before or even on the weekend, and then just heat it up during the week for your child. And it takes the same amount of time as getting the cereal out to pour it and give the milk, maybe an extra, 2 minutes to heat it. But I like to add in some grated carrots and grated zucchini, because who says you don't need to have vegetables at breakfast? Zucchini has no taste. Carrots add a little bit of sweetness. And what you can do is make it fun for your kids. Add in a little bit of milk and then give them some frozen wild blueberries, and it turns the milk purple. So it's fun. It's like, all right, okay, this is naturally purple because of the blueberries. Or add in, some stewed apples or some fresh, almond butter with some goji berries that are kind of like red raisins. And so it becomes more fun when the child actually gets to add their toppings and more interactive. And when you start this at an early age, this is at least more of a nutrient dense breakfast that has tons of fiber and tons of nutrients that you're already getting just in the first meal of the day.
Yeah, it's great. And I think, I'm big on helping parents think about, okay, what are you doing now? And how can we make some swaps for that? So, okay, if your child's eating certain types of cereal now, it doesn't mean that you have to take all cereal away, but can you swap? Can you make sort of a lateral swap? Okay, cereal.
Add some fruit to it,
Yeah, or a cereal, like looking at the nutrition facts going, oh my gosh, I had no idea this cereal that you eat every day has 15 grams of sugar per serving. Let's experiment. Let's find some that have way less than that, or kind of just thinking along those lines.
Well, taking baby steps of where you're at. If you're at this sugary cereal, add some fruit in there, maybe some avocado on the side with a piece of like sourdough toast, so to add in some more nutrients, and then slowly phase out that cereal to a less sugary cereal, and then eventually move from the cereal to maybe a granola or then to an oatmeal. And so I think it just comes down to taking those steps. Don't feel so overwhelmed, but what's the lateral progress that you can make? And then from there, my big thing is pancakes. I think those are fun for kids, and you can add them into their snack plate or their lunch boxes as leftovers, but how we make the pancakes is a big difference in what we're using and what we're using to sweeten. I love to sweeten my pancakes. I use bananas. And what's great about banana is you've got the fiber. And so it doesn't give you that huge insulin spike that's going to happen with all of your other sugar, all of your other sweeteners, even your low calorie sweeteners. You're still going to get that insulin spike, and your body's going to think, oh, I need to absorb all that sugar. And then guess what? You're hungry an hour later. You want to know why your kids are constantly snacking all day and asking for food. It's because you're giving them too much sugar.
That's such a great point, because I think especially during the pandemic, when kids and parents were home together all day, that was a huge complaint, right? They're
Mom, I'm hungry. Dad, I'm hungry.
Yeah. And it's like the way that you address that is by giving them food that sticks with them longer, which is what food is supposed to do. That's what
you want. Some fiber, you want some fat in there and a little bit of protein. You definitely want to give kids carbohydrates, but just think about the kinds of carbohydrates you're giving them. And so when I think about pancakes, what do I want to add? I want to look at buckwheat flour. I want to look at teff flour. Those are really nutrient dense grains that don't give you that huge insulin spike in the beginning. And so it has enough protein in there. And if you throw in some eggs, you can even make it vegan with like a, freshly ground chia seeds and put in the water, and you make it a vegan egg if you're vegan. But there's lots of options in there. Throw in a banana with the egg, some flour, little bit of, I use plant-based milk. I even throw in a little bit of blackstrap molasses for that extra iron and calcium, and it has that touch of sweetness, and that pancake's done. You can even throw it into a blender, add in, some spinach that has no taste. And then you've got your, green Hulk pancakes, and you can reheat those throughout the week. Use them in your child's lunchbox. Oh, I don't even have to think about lunch. Just put in some pancakes right there, make it a little bit different. Throw in some, sunflower butter, almond butter in between them, make them little sandwich, sandwich pancakes. So if you start to get creative with your food a little bit, and those are little baby steps you can take, your child starts to take more interest in it too, because if you're interested in food, it will go down to your child, because children inevitably mimic everything you do.
And I think, setting kids up right out of the gate in the morning with a nutrient dense breakfast, especially that includes, more proteins and healthy fats and those, nutrient dense carbs, not the white breads and that kind of stuff. It's so critical. And we've got good studies that show that just making sure that kids get a good dose of protein in the morning supports focus and attention and all of those things then, as they head off to school. I like that a lot of the things that you're talking about can be made ahead, because I do think that's a barrier, particularly in the morning, right? I'm a mom of 4. You have, 3 kids, 1 on the way. Like, we get it. Mornings are not the time for most of us. Some of you may be the exception to be like, around the kitchen, whipping up some 4-course fancy thing. Like, that's not what happens in my house, but we look at what can we make ahead. Can we do like egg and sausage burritos that we make ahead and then we have those for the week, or even just sausages or pancakes or oatmeal or those kinds of things that to make your life easier, because the reality is most of us are not going to be whipping up major breakfasts, especially with kids at different ages that we have to get out of the door at different times. Like, we need to keep it simple for ourselves.
Yeah. Like, I have like a chia seed pudding recipe that literally you just pour a few things and stick it in the fridge. And then the next morning it's ready to go. I have an overnight oats recipe that literally put the oats in, pour a few things, it's ready to go the next morning. And you don't have to cook anything.
Yeah.
And so those are also easy things that you can incorporate into your like weekly breakfast menu for your kids.
Yeah. Also things that are pretty simple, like that kids can help with.
Yeah.
You know, all of those like that's stuff that kids can get in the kitchen and help you with. So I love that. Let's talk about some snacks, because it's funny because I wanted to talk about breakfast and snacks because these are the two big things that come up where parents are like, I don't know what to give them for breakfast, and then the snack thing. So when we're thinking about sugars, we're thinking about added sugars, we're thinking about nutrient density, like what are some of the go-to snacky kinds of things that you find are really good for families to have on hand?
I'm going to give you my list, but I'm going to start off with this stat. About 80% of snack foods in this grocery store that you will find have added sugar. So keep that in mind. So that's why I'm going to give you my favorite list, and they are nutrient dense snacks. So one of my favorites are Scout bars. I think they are it's very difficult to find a bar that does not have added sugar, that does not have, terrible ingredients in it. These Scout bars have like about anywhere between 4 and 6 ingredients typically, and they're sweetened with dates. So the dates have the fiber, and they're all nut-free, which is great because they're made with sunflower or coconut, sunflower seeds or coconut. And so I think those are a great option for kids, and they really love them. I brought them to my son's first soccer game this weekend for his, friends, and none of them had them, and they were all asking for more.
That's great. I've not heard of those, so I'm going to look into those. And that's so great that they're nut-free too, because that's an issue a lot of families run into with school rules around nut-free, and like, oh my gosh, what do I send?
And they're the perfect size. They're like literally the size of your, my hands are small, my thumb, so it's Scout, SKOUT.
Wonderful. Okay. Awesome. Love that.
Next thing, Seaweed. I think Seaweed is like the new chip. And, most kids are actually iodine deficient. And so you get, because they're not consuming enough in their diet. And so iodine is a great way to get it through Seaweed. And it's such a fun, salty kind of snack. And I like the brand Sea Snacks, SNAX. And it's because they use organic olive oil instead of some of the other inflammatory oils. And if you're listening to this, I have a whole pantry list on my blog where I actually write out all the different snacks and where you can get them with hyperlinks.
Awesome. And we'll link to that in the show notes too, so people can easily access it.
Great. Some of my other fun snacks are Lundberg rice crackers. They're red rice and quinoa, and they're flat crackers. And what I like to do with them is put like some avocado on top, some furikake, which is basically a blend of different sesame seeds. Or you can put on almond butter, a drizzle of honey. There's a lot of different toppings, and you can get creative with your kids. You can put on, cream cheese or vegan cheese, and you can put on some radishes on top, or some microgreens, or some fruit like sliced figs, or sliced peaches, whatever's in season. And it becomes a fun interactive snack as well for your kids.
Great. And the things that kids can sort of get their hands in and have choices over and kind of mess around with, that just helps to expand their palate and their interest in trying some of these things too. If they tend to be a little bit more on the rigid side about what they eat, just exploring and, making different things and playing with it can be a great way to get them interested.
Yeah. The other thing I'd like to swap out. So typically kids are asking for like those fruit by the foots.
I was going to say like fruit snacks. Yeah.
Fruit snacks. Okay. So the brand I love is Soley, SOLEY. It's 1 or 2 ingredient, either fruit snacks or they're like fruit strips.
Yeah.
And they have that mango and banana or pineapple in them. And that's it. And you've got the fiber in it too. So that's what I love, is that you're not missing that. Versus like, say, juice. Juice is like my one thing that I actually say, please avoid juice. There's no nutrients whatsoever in juice. You might think, oh, there's vitamin C. Actually, the vitamin C gets knocked out by, the process of breaking down and cooking down those fruits. And there's
Absolutely. And I find that just targeting beverages is often a good way to put a dent in kids' added sugar intake, because between things like sodas, sports drinks, even a lot of the flavored waters, and certainly the juices out there, even if parents and families were to start there, with, just quite frankly, not bringing soda into the house at all. And with juice and stuff, like watering it down, like getting your kids off of the sugary beverages.
Yes, and just diluting it down.
Point. Yeah.
Is a huge point. And once you've diluted it down, you can add fun things to the water. Like when passion fruit's in season, I scoop it and like freeze it so I can have passion fruit all season long. And I make ice cubes and I throw that passion fruit ice cube into the water. I'll throw in cucumbers into the water. I'll throw strawberries into the water and let the kids do it. And they think it's really fun. But I think we digress from snacks. So that's my fault. Another snack I love is called Pan's mushroom jerky. So you can do beef jerky as well if you eat meat, but Pan's mushroom jerky actually uses mushrooms and just a touch of coconut sugar, especially if you're just getting the plain. And my kids are obsessed with it. And I find that all of their friends actually really like it. And they think it's beef jerky, but it's got a lot of nutrients in there.
It's another one that's new to me. I'm excited. I'm learning some new things. And I'll say that I love the Paleo Valley meat sticks. And, a lot of our families love those. And so I encourage that. Again, just clean ingredients. So many of those, even in the stores, they've got added sugar in them.
Yeah.
Things like the Slim Jims and the other kinds. So you really want to look for products that don't.
Yeah.
So
they've got the added sugars and a lot of them have the dyes and preservatives in there, that's the problem with snacks is those preservatives. How do you think they stay so shelf stable? And those preservatives impact us.
Yeah.
So other things that I like, freeze-dried fruits and veggies. So Natera makes a bunch of different ones. They've got ones that have like corn and peas in there and it's freeze-dried. So like when you're drying them, they're drying them at the peak of when their nutrients are most bioavailable. And so that's another great option if things aren't in season or if it's, don't have farmers markets around you. I also love those for traveling because they're just easy if I can't get enough, veggies and produce and fruits in my kids, I bring those with me.
Yeah, that's a great one. And you're right. It keeps it simple for travel or even just being in the car after school. If you're going between school and sports or whatever, and you want things that are convenient. Those are great options.
Yeah. My number two things are like the Scout bars and the Seaweed, because I can keep them in my car.
Yes, that's great.
The Scout bars, they might melt a little bit depending on where you are if it's too hot. But I keep them in my purse for, just in case. But honestly, just fruit. Yeah. I'd rather you guys, instead of just giving a juice box, I'd always go for the whole fruit, an apple, a banana, and mix up the fruits. Yeah. Let your child go to the grocery store and they get to pick one item from the produce section that they get to try, and it could be something fun and new, like it's a mango or, a dragon fruit or a kiwi or whatever it might be, and let them get involved in the decision-making process. And then they're more likely to even eat it.
Let's remind people of the difference there, between, a piece of fruit and the juice or a processed food with the fruit in it, about why that's important. What are we getting in the whole piece of fruit that's so important? Because fruit does have natural sugar. Like there might be some people who are like, well, things like
fruit is sugar.
Bananas have a lot of sugar in them. But so I want
you're correct.
Why that makes a difference.
So I think we want to trust nature. All right. So when humans take over, we're taking those fruits and cooking them down and taking away all the fiber and all the nutrients. And so you're just cooking it down to the sugar. Whereas if you take a fruit like an apple, let's say, you've got the peel that has tons of fiber in it. And what you're looking for with that fiber is that it balances out the sugar. So again, you don't have that huge increase in insulin. And then an hour later, your kids are hungry again. Mom, Dad, I'm hungry. Give me more food. And grumpy, I'm hangry. Right. Come on. And if you balance that out, and if you take it a step further and pair that apple with some almond butter, even better, sunflower butter, because then you get some fat and some protein there, So I always like to design my snacks with some kind of fat or protein. So if you got cucumbers, pair it with some hummus. Your kid's not into hummus. Throw some beets in there or buy the pink hummus. That's your beet hummus. Right. And then it's pink. My kids, my girls will eat anything that's pink right now. Pink and purple, their favorite colors. So I think if you just make it a little bit more fun, and if you're eating it, they will also eat it. That's my biggest piece of advice, is to model it for them And then my second piece of advice is to educate.
Yeah. Yeah. To talk with them about it. And I think snacks are a good place to push the envelope a little bit, like what you were saying earlier about parents decide what's served and when, kids decide whether to eat and how much. And I think snacks are often a starting point that can feel a little more comfortable for parents. Like sometimes when it comes to meals, there's
you're more concerned
and our own issues around like, oh my gosh, what if they don't eat? But snacks, like kids can live without eating snacks.
100%.
Snacks are sometimes like a place where we feel a little more confident to push and to say, well, this is what we're having today, or to offer 2 nutrient dense options, because if they choose not to eat, you've got a meal coming up. And so I just have found that can be helpful for people.
I definitely agree with, I always say snacks and lunchtime. On the weekends is when I introduce something new, or I try to play with the meal a little bit, because if they're not hungry, that's all right. Yeah. I know there's still dinner and they had breakfast in the morning, so they're good to go.
Yeah.
But honestly, what I tell parents is to always look at a 2-week period. If in 2 weeks they haven't eaten much, then you go to your doctor. But if it's up and down within those 2 weeks, and there's days where like, oh, they ate so much, and then the next day they didn't eat anything, that's more normal. Because look at yourself as an adult. One day you may be obsessed with avocado, and the next day I can't stand avocado. Your taste buds change. Or you get sick of eating the same thing. Kids are the same thing. And you also have to look at a child's personality. I always tell parents this. I really despise the word picky, because I don't believe that there are picky kids. I think there's kids who tend to be more cautious, kids who tend to be more adventurous, and everywhere in between, because if you call your kid picky, trust me, they're going to hear it and they're going to internalize that. And they're going to be like, oh, I'm not going to eat that. I'm picky. I don't like that.
Becomes their identity.
100%. So really try to avoid that word, and try to avoid thinking, oh, my child's not going to eat that. Try to avoid saying that.
Oh, I love that. I want to touch on, before we wrap up, because you had mentioned it a minute ago in talking about snacks, we've kind of delved into the sugar issues, but let's talk about those added preservatives and chemicals. Let's talk about how much of that is in our food. I mean, talking about differences between like when we were growing up and now, and just the amount of these chemicals that are allowed in foods, that appear in foods now, and why that's important for parents to be thinking about.
So since the 1950s up until now, we've had a 500% increase in artificial food dyes in our food. And so that's when you can say like, oh, well, we used to eat that. Well, not really. We didn't used to eat that as much. And now it's so prevalent. It's in the majority of our packaged foods. And the problem with preservatives and these artificial dyes is that they impact behavior, and the sleep is a huge problem. I think that's the most, on my top 5 question I get is a sleep question, sleep and behavior. And I'm sure you do too. And those are some of the first questions I ask. I ask about artificial food dyes, preservatives, and sugar. And then I ask about screen time. Those are the things that are impacting our kids.
Well, and it's interesting because, here in the States, at least, parents will go, well, these things must be safe. They're allowed in our foods. And it's like, well, wait a minute. We have a very different way in our country of going about approving for this stuff. I mean, I think a lot of parents are surprised to find out that food dyes, for example, artificial food dyes, a lot of those that are allowed in our food supply here in the States are banned in Europe, and companies make products. And
they're different there.
Over there, because they're not allowed to put that stuff in, because those countries have looked at the research and have said, no, actually, these things are detrimental to the brain function and the health and the development of kids. We're not going to put these in our food supply. And yet here in the States, try to pick up a snack food or a cereal or whatever that doesn't have that stuff in it, right?
And it's not only just our packaged foods that have it. It's your yogurts. It's your salmon is dyed.
Yep.
It's artificially dyed. Your pickles, your salad dressing.
Yes.
It's in everything. And we have 9 food dyes that are approved by the FDA. Most of those are not approved in Europe, like you said. So if you actually compare the foods, like Heinz ketchup in the UK versus here, it's completely different. It has no high fructose corn syrup. It has no red dye 40 in it. And same with a lot of our cereals and snacks and whatnot. And so that makes you think, well, what's going on here? And so I think you just have to really pay attention to your labels. And that's what I teach my kids. And I think you should teach your kids too. When you go to the grocery store, when they're not hungry. My number one piece of advice, make sure they're not hungry.
Pro tip right there.
or give them a snack plate, like in the car on the way. So they're nice and full, and then they can help you, and then give them a job in the grocery store and have them sit. Let's look at this label. What does it say? I'm going to tell you if you can't read it, and say like, what's that word? I don't even know what that word is. Do an experiment, look it up. Be like, oh, an artificial food dye is basically petroleum, which is where gasoline comes from. That's what's in it. So, talking about it with your kids helps them question it too.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you raised all of the stuff like condiments and all of that, because often parents will say to me like, well, I'm pretty cautious about that in their snacks and whatever. And yet then I have them go and actually look at the ingredients on stuff they use all the time. And it's in the dressings, it's in the ketchup, mustard, the pickles, all kinds of things that
my girlfriend was shocked. It was in her salmon. She was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. I put lox on bagels and it's in the salmon.
Yep. So what are the things that parents, so you said like things that you don't even know what they are, you can't pronounce them, those are good tips. How about for the dyes? Are they always labeled as like red 5, blue 40, those kinds of things?
They are always labeled like that. You've got yellow 6, red 40, there's 9 of them. And you can always, honestly, you can screenshot a photo on like the 9 FDA approved food dyes and just take a look at it. But honestly, when you look at your nutrition labels, you don't want to have more than like 10 ingredients. Maybe if there's a bunch of different spices in there, but look and read. If you don't know an ingredient, I'd put it away.
Yeah. And I think the food dye stuff is particularly compelling from a research standpoint on kids' brain development, especially when we look at common symptoms that end up getting diagnosed as things like ADHD, even autism spectrum disorders, different things like that. But also, it's been really interesting to me delving into the newer microbiome research on food dyes and seeing the profound negative impact that these dyes and preservatives are having on the beneficial microorganisms in our gut, and that whole connection to our brain function and just our overall
allergies to asthma. These are why these things are on the rise.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, we're talking about it from a brain and behavior standpoint, but getting these food dyes and things reduced or completely out of your family's diet is going to help with all of the physical health stuff too.
Yeah, especially your oral health, which is very much tied to your gut health. Like there's so many kids now that I'm seeing have cavities. Kids, their teeth are being pulled. They're having root canals at the age of 3 years old. So that is definitely a tough one for me to see.
Which is, makes me think too. And, we don't have time to get into all personal care products and that, but I know you have a lot of information on household stuff and all that, but even being vigilant about looking at the ingredient labels on things like toothpaste, when you mentioned that, like there can be a lot of added sugars and sweeteners.
Yes.
There can be, dyes and these things in toothpaste. And you think, what in the world? It's white. And it's like, it's white because they added a blue dye and something else.
Or titanium dioxide to actually make it pure white.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so,
or they put in the stripes of color in there.
Yeah. Just even being aware of that, like, it's not just in the stuff that we think of as food, but kids are brushing their teeth every single day.
It's in your beauty products and your cleans, like all their makeup, everything. It's in all of it.
And I think that, one of the things that can happen, as we said, is that parents can feel overwhelmed by this, but I really like to reframe it and say, but look at all the opportunity here. By understanding this, it gives us so many opportunities on whatever pace and level we want to, deal with it to make positive changes in our kids' health, in their brain function, and our entire family's health. Like when we understand this, it just gives us so many actionable targets of things that we can start to change and do differently, which I think is really relieving and, exciting as opposed to scary and overwhelming.
I like to tell parents, like, look, social toxins can be worse than chemical ones. And what I mean by that is like the worry, the being overwhelmed. Yes. So I want you to take that into consideration and then just think, all right, I'm not going to freak out about my kid's toothpaste right now, but when it's done, I'm going to look for a different one.
Perfect.
So whenever you're shopping for a new one because you're out of something, swap.
Yeah.
So don't go out and replace everything. Yeah. It's not, terrible, because obviously our body has natural detox abilities. But go and make those swaps as you run out of items.
Which fits with, the mantra that I love, which is, as we know better, we do better.
100%.
One step at a time with that. So Natasha, this has been great. So many great practical reminders, strategies, products that we can be looking at. I want to make sure that people know where they can find out more about you, the work that you're doing, and like the food lists and things. Where can they get all those goodies?
So on my website is Dr. Organic Mommy, Dr. Organic Mommy. And then my Instagram is the @Dr. Organic Mommy. And you can go look there, and I've got tons of discount codes, and all the proceeds from my page go to charity, and I outline that as well.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing around all of this, for educating families around this important information, and for taking the time to share it with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for doing the work as well and educating. I love always meeting another psychologist who is so aware of the impacts of diet and the environment on our children.
Thank you. There's not a lot of us. We got to stick together, right?
100%.
And thanks to all of you, as always, for being here and listening. We'll catch you back here next time.